Nick Ferrari at breakfast on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Well, we've got 9 minutes before 8 is the time. Back to the Passport Office conversation in just a moment. Now to other matters. And if you've listened to me for some time, you'll know that I have been in this business for a while. So it takes us quite a story to make me read the headline twice in disbelief. But here is one this morning. I take it from today's Times newspaper. It's in other papers as well. Prison guards give way to Islamists. Prison staff are so concerned about being accused of racism, Muslim terrorists have been able to seize control of wings, set up Sharia courts behind bars, so says a report by the terrorism watchdog, which goes on to say that in some instances they then hand out floggings to other convicts. What the hell is going on in our jails? And in another paper, today's Sun newspaper, one politician says he's going to stamp it out. I refer to Justice Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab, who joins me now. Good to have you on, Deputy Prime Minister. What are you going to do to end this? Good morning.
Good morning, Nick. Well, first of all, let's recognise what's happened. We've now got 200 prisoners in our jails who have been convicted of terrorism offences, another 200 prisoners convicted of other offences who have terrorist concern. That is the highest ever. So what I would say is both qualitatively and in terms of sheer numbers, the scale of dealing with extremism and terrorism inside the prison estate has changed. And that's partly because we've convicted more terrorists and more bad people. I think there's a whole range of things. First of all, I accept the findings, the conclusions of the Hall report. I've been to two Cathay high security... Sorry,
that's just Jonathan Hall. Just explain the QC. On you go. Just explain who Hall is. On you go, sir.
And I've been to two of our Cathay prisons with separation centres, Woodhill and Franklin, to see for myself. There's a whole range of things we've got to do. First of all, it is right, as you described, that we must not allow religious or cultural sensitivities, as important as they are, to deter us from clamping down and nipping in the bud early the precursor signs of radicalisation and ultimately terrorist recruitment. And that can be things like the step from eating halal, which of course we want to respect inside prisons, to requiring others on their wing or in their kitchens to follow Sharia rules. That clearly is a points along the spectrum, but that must be stopped. And we're going to give prison governors greater latitude, greater authority to do that. We also, and with that number of prisoners of terrorist concern, you've got a difficult balancing act where there are people who have been convicted of relatively I say low-level offences. You want to try and rehabilitate them. You want to get them involved in mainstream things like work in prisons, education, rehabilitation of various sorts. But where those individuals pose a threat, they risk poisoning the well inside prison, either because they will engage in radicalisation or ultimately terrorist acts, violent acts. They must be removed. So I'm going to be investing £1.2 million in the teams that target for separation those kind of prisoners who present that threat. We're going to be making greater use of our separation centres, and we're also, through our Bill of Rights, which will replace the Human Rights Act, provide greater legal safeguard against what we're seeing, which is the litigation attrition of those prisoners claiming a right to socialise when actually what they want to do is radicalise. We're going to nip that in the bud, and it shows you, Nick, and we've talked about this before, another illustration of why our Bill of Rights is so important.
I'm brave enough to serve as a prison officer, Deputy Prime Minister. I've been in the job for 30, 40 years. What are you going to do to protect me if I take action against a group of Muslim prisoners who then say I acted in a racist manner? I hear the investment that you're putting in, but those men and women need some kind of protection or support or comfort too, don't they, Mr. Raab?
They absolutely do. Look, of course, equally, I don't want any racism or anti-Islam behaviour inside prisons, but our prison officers do the most incredible job. And Nick, while we're on, I would just say this. Compared to other emergency service workers, police, NHS staff, who rightly we applaud, I don't think people see enough, because they're out of sight, out of mind, the incredible job prison staff do, but particularly in these Cat A prisons. So I will stand full square behind them. But more than that, because warm words are not enough, we're providing the money so that we can target the real troublemakers. We've got the facilities. We've got 28 separation centre places. We only use 9 at the moment. I want to back them in making greater use of it, and we'll provide the legal protection through the Bill of Rights, which will replace the human rights, which through its elastic interpretations has allowed, I think is crazy, I think people will be surprised to hear, people that present an extremist or terrorist threat being able to claim a right to socialise within the prison estate.
Do we have any idea how many sentences of flogging have been handed out by these self-appointed Sharia courts, Deputy Prime Minister?
No, and it's, look, we have a there's always an issue with controlling violence, particularly in Cat A prisons, of prisoners against prisoners, prisoners against prison officers. But you can see how this happens in a very subtle and surreptitious way. We start with the understandable respect for religious observance. We then find kitchens and no-go areas for those that will not respect them. Then there is, if you like, a regime within a regime, and we've just got to cut it out far earlier so we don't get ourselves anywhere near the kind of punishment being meted out that you described. And therefore, from my point of view, preventative, early, decisive action is the key. That's what Jonathan Hall has, I think, fairly diagnosed. That is what we're going to do.
How these jails within a jail, as you refer to them, these separation centres, they're fairly grim places, I imagine, Deputy Prime Minister. Is that fair to say?
Well, they're humane. They have washing facilities, they've got eating facilities, they've got exercise yards. But look, it's pretty Spartan in there. That's the way it should be. We're not doing it as a punishment. We're doing it as protection of our prison staff, protection of other prisoners, but ultimately protection for the public against the radicalisation that otherwise risks happening in prisons and will spill over into our society. My number one job, the government's number one job, is to protect the public, and we will always keep that in mind.
I asked the question last year. You've not probably had time to see it. Have you seen the write-up about you in today's Times newspaper when you attended a magistrate prison, Wood Hill? Dominic Raab, I read to you, Dominic Raab was met with repeated shouts of Allah Akbar by prisoners circling the small exercise area at Wood Hill Jail in Milton Keynes, dubbed Britain's toughest jail by the Justice Secretary himself. The shouts were soon drowned out by the barking of 2 Alsatian dogs straining at their leashes as Raab waited to be let into the jail within a jail that's home to 4 of the most dangerous terrorists in the country. It was not a comfortable visit for Dominic Raab. Is that true?
Well, look, these aren't particularly pleasant places, but it's perfectly comfortable for me. It's my job. I've been to Wood Hill, been to Franklin. If you don't go inside, you don't get it's all very well reading Jonathan Hall's report, talking to him. You've got to go and see it for yourself. You've got to talk to the staff. You've got to feel what it is like. So I've got no problem with that. That's part of my job. And of course, I get an opportunity to thank the brilliant teams, the prison officers who keep us all safe, and as I said, are often out of sight, out of mind, but do an incredible job for us.
OK, I've only got another minute or so with you. A couple of other matters. I understand you and your colleagues are trying to ease the so-called cost of living crisis. Is it right that the MOT test on our cars will go to every other year instead of annual? Mr. Raab?
Well, we've got a 22 billion package of support for the cost of living, including everything from rebates on energy bills to discounts on council tax. But I think it's absolutely right that the Prime Minister directs, that the Cabinet discusses every single thing we could possibly do. I'm not going to comment on leaked reports from Cabinet, but I can tell you that in the area, in all of these sort of cost of living, quality of life areas, childcare is something that we've discussed, cost of housing. But in all of these areas, we're going to look at what further we can do to ease the pinch on families across the country.
Suitcases filled with cash from taxpayer-backed COVID loans were seized at the border as people tried to smuggle them out of the country. This speaks to, sometimes, the inefficiency of the scheme. Deputy Prime Minister?
Look, first of all, it's good news that they were seized in the way you described. That shows you law enforcement's working. But the reality was, during the pandemic, we did take emergency action. We did get rid of some of the rule-making and procedures and box-ticking that otherwise would apply rightly, because we were in the business of saving thousands of businesses and 15 million jobs. And I think at the time, if we would have been criticised if we'd have not taken the action to expedite that financial support, support and keep the economy moving through one of the grimmest periods in recent living memory. But of course, we'll learn the lessons from it as well.
Lastly, is it part of the role of the Home Secretary to attend a Bond premiere?
I think it's perfectly legitimate. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. The Home Secretary works incredibly hard.
So part of the benefits are to see the latest Bond film, Mr. Raab?
Well, I don't know the circumstance around it, but given how hard the Home Secretary works, frankly, I don't begrudge her going to see a movie one night, and particularly given, of course, the links with the Home Office in both the fictional but also the factual service that is MI5.
Shouldn't you be there as well? You're the Justice Secretary, shouldn't you? You've got a free ticket or two, Mr. Raab?
Well, I've got plenty on my plate, so I don't begrudge the Home Sec a night out.
Good to have you on the show. Thank you, Dominic Raab, Justice Secretary, Deputy Prime Minister, appearing here on LBC at 1 minute after 8. News with Thomas Watts is next.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss is to call for Ukraine